Well, hello everyone. This week we're looking at education adjustments, which flows on from the work that we have done previously around universal design for learning. So last week was about UDL. So what I want you to do is pause for a moment and have a think about these questions to remind yourself of what we were doing. So if we remember back, universal design for learning is about planning for the most students you possibly can before you even know who you're going to be teaching. A bit like a building designer designs for the most accessible buildings long before they know who's going to go into the building. They just assume that some people are going to require some of the design features. For our learners' situation, we can plan an awful lot in just a well-designed lesson plan. But then some students will need extra. So you can have things built into products. So there's a box of hand cream that's got Braille on the side. There if you need it, and it doesn't matter if you don't. Similarly, Braille on door signs. And you can see the third picture is some stairs, and they have the raised dots that are there for a person who's using a cane, and that they know then that there's an obstacle ahead. So it could be stairs down or up, or it could be a ramp, or it could be the edge of a road. So they're aware. And if you don't have any those needs, it doesn't matter, you just walk right on. Similarly, in building design, some people will need more than what you can just provide. So in products, there's a natty little device that instead of putting Braille on banknotes, which would make them stick in ATMs and would flatten over time, there's a device that helps people who need to use Braille to be able to tell what sort of note they have. There was a very sad situation in the late 50s and 60s in Australia and around the world where pregnant women were offered a drug thalidomide to help them with symptoms of morning sickness. Sadly, that led to severe deformation of the developing fetus, and so we have now people in our community who are thalidomide survivors, and one of those people is a good friend of mine, and she has a very modified house. She doesn't have arms and she doesn't have legs. She's got hands and feet, and so she can do a tremendous amount of things with very adapted aspects. So her house, I could live in it, but it's a very modified house, and so it's more than universal design. Similarly, in learning, we have to provide extra adjustments for some learners. So we'll be thinking in our class today about differentiated instruction and providing personalised learning supports for students who need particularly adjusted curriculum. So when we're thinking about the effectiveness of the educational experience, there are at least 4 factors we can consider. There's the learner, the teacher, the setting, and the curriculum. So planning personalised learning and support, which is a requirement of the Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards for Education, we have to be thinking about those 4 aspects. There's a link there that you can find for this particular document. In the guiding principles, this is an important one. All students can learn. Now, you'd think that would be obvious, but there are people, and I dare say I've worked with a few of them, who just assumed that some subjects, such as mathematics, were just beyond people. And you hear this in the community, oh, I was never any good at maths. But we know that all students can learn if they're given the right teaching and the right support. Every child has a right to high quality education, clearly, and effective teachers provide engaging and rigorous learning experiences for all students. Now, the all students is the critical bit, and they've got to be engaging and rigorous. Now, you may have been in a class yourself where it wasn't a particularly engaging learning experience, and maybe it was pretty easy. Maybe it wasn't rigorous. Maybe the challenge wasn't there. So that's some of the things that we must provide. And so our gifted learners, for example, really need to be supported. And our students who've got learning difficulties, they can't be just served up a teaching experience of pretty boring, dull, repetitive work. So looking at that next one, a safe and stimulating environment. That's one of the guiding principles. And for students with a disability, reasonable adjustments should be made where required. In fact, it's the law. So there are 4 steps. The photograph's an interesting one. It shows a class, Year 4 class, and the day that I was there were 2 little girls who were in school for the very first time in their lives. So one of the first things you need to do to personalise learning is get to know the student and understand where their needs are. You need to consult. So consult with the student if they're old enough and able to, but definitely with their carer or the parent. Then you plan it, and then you evaluate how you went. Now, these things are requirements of the Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Standards for Education, but they're also the creative side of teaching. And that was the teacher of that class that I mentioned just before, and he was able to do some really wonderful things about adjusting through the use of groups, but all the children came together at the end to share their learning. So the little ones that were learning about what school was like had an opportunity to learn not just from the teacher, but from the other kids as well. There's a great long list of instructional adjustments, and on the Blackboard site, as well as at the bottom of the slide, there's the reference to where these materials are. These aren't exhaustive, this list of instructional adjustments, but they're there as ideas. You can also adjust the environment. Again, this list isn't exhaustive, but it's got some ideas for you to think about. And I suggest that you might take a look through those, pick 10 and do a traffic light thing. Those you've used and worked well for you, those you've tried but you weren't really all that good, although you might have seen them that somebody else does. And then you might have some that you've never seen or used before. We're going to pursue the idea of learning characteristics of the individual. It's a really important thing to recognise that while we might consider the learning characteristics, we aren't considering this from a deficit perspective. We're considering this from a perspective of what does the learner bring to the learning situation and how do we best support them in their learning. There's a link down the bottom here where you can see that there's students with disability specific resources. So you can go to that site and you can find links to a lot of community organisations. We're going to think about what you might do for a learner who needs support with attention, and there are some strategies there. Thought processing, I'm going to whip through these because you can pause it and read them slowly and think about the sorts of things that might help. Memory is a big deal for many learners, but it's often not so much do they remember. There are all sorts of aspects of memory, so I'm going to have a bit of a look about that. You might want to think about What's your earliest memory? And I loved this quote, so I wanted to include it for you. Everything in life is memory, save for the thin edge of the present. So for those like me who think their memory is not too good, the fact that I do have memories of more than what's happening right at this moment does suggest to me that my memory is there, though sometimes aspects of it cause me concern. So if we think about memory, memory can fail to work because of blockage in any one of three components. If you've got that tip of the tongue phenomenon, you know, where you can, I can remember that, what is that word? Oh, it starts with B, that sort of thing. It's the retrieval component that's failing because it's in your memory, but just getting it out that's the issue. If you're thinking about it like a filing cabinet, you can think about, well, you've got to take in the information for a start. Then you've got to store it well so that you can get it out again. So if you've taken the information at all and put it into a filing cabinet, if you just dump it in there, the chance that you'll be able to retrieve it when you need it is pretty limited. Whereas if it's carefully filed, then you can go back to it, as long as you remember your filing system. So all of these aspects are a part of memory and why it can cause problems. There are different models, and this is an older model, but there's sensory memory. With short-term memory, there's rehearsal, and then there's long-term memory. A more updated model, perhaps, though both models you see are around Baddeley's working memory system. And in the working memory, there's this central executive, a phonological loop, which is a voice, episodic buffer, holds and integrates diverse information, and the visual sketch pad. This is an interesting one because a lot of mathematics is done in that, where you see it in diagrams and you can just see it, and it only lasts a very, very short amount of time. Some people talk about the difference between declarative and procedural memory in long-term memory. So you can have declarative, where you can say it, and then procedural, you can do it. And I've got this archery thing because once upon a time I was on a school camp and I had to teach archery, which I'd never done myself, but at breakfast, they gave me the manual and said, you're on archery after morning tea. I nearly died. Well, I managed to read enough of the manual to have good declarative knowledge, so I could tell people like a pro how to shoot an arrow. The only trouble is I had no procedural knowledge because I hadn't actually ever tried it. And so I thought, well, after I'd got the kids all firing arrows, I might have a go. Well, I nearly took my elbow off because there's a particular step that you need to make sure your elbow is tucked in, which I missed. And so my declarative knowledge probably is okay. My procedural knowledge was not so good. You can have a look at an overview of the different parts of memory in that YouTube clip. Ways to support memory are things like pictorial timetables, step-by-step guides, keeping careful notes. We can support our learners, but it's really important not to use that as a deficit. Their long-term memory or their short-term memory, or they've got working memory problems. They're just aspects, characteristics of a learner, but we can support them to learn. And we need to be careful as well that maybe they do know, but the retrieval part in the questions we ask might be the challenge. So we might be asking a student, when do you need to go? And they're thinking, I don't know what word that is. Does that mean where or who? Or because all those question words sound very similar in English and they look very similar, and they can be very confusing for learners. So here's an example of a sequencing aid, And these things you can see, you can find lots of these resources on the internet. But here's another one, task analysis, breaking a task down into simple steps. So we see this commonly in all aspects of our lives. It can be very helpful for a learner with a disability, but we have to acknowledge that all of us use them, and so they're a very common strategy. So task analysis is a technique where you work out what's got to be done. So it could be a maths problem, breaking the maths problem down into small steps, or it could be a science experiment, breaking that down into small steps. And you can either do all of the steps except the last one and leave that for the individual, or you can gradually teach the sequence. You can go from the back, you can get them to start, and then you do the rest, and so on. Systematic instruction is a way of just making sure then that those steps are explicitly taught. And you can use those to maintain the skills, but the important thing is that a person's got to have lots of different opportunities to learn and to practice and to do those skills, because if memory is unstable, then we need lots of opportunity and lots of support. So some instructional support ideas are going to come in the next few slides, and I'll move through them quite quickly so that you can pause them and have a look at them as you need. Cues and prompts, the idea with behaviours, the cues trigger a particular behaviour, and what we want to do is provide the prompts when they're needed and then fade them away as the person needs them no longer. So if the telephone rings, you know to answer it. So that's a natural cue. But sometimes people aren't aware that they need to respond in a particular way. So if in a classroom the children are being told to pack up and move to the door and they're not quite sure what that means, they might be having to give explicit instruction. So a prompt assists a person to know when and how to perform a skill. You can give verbal prompts clearly, but you can also model. You can show what is needed to be done. And this is one of the really powerful aspects of inclusive classrooms, because the other kids often are doing it, and the child who's struggling a bit has models for copying. There's also non-spoken communication, of course. You can have physical prompts and hand-over-hand guidance. So here we've got an instructor guiding. If you work in those particular contexts, there are very clear rules about what is appropriate touching of another person. And if you're not qualified, if you haven't been trained, it is really important that you avoid touching a person in a way that could be considered inappropriate. Certainly touching a person on the back of their shoulders or on their arms is not considered to be inappropriate. But other more personal touching, you need to be particularly careful about. Chaining is a sequence of tasks and the steps being. Reinforcement is a psychological term, and this is where if you want the behaviour to increase, you apply a reinforcement to it. And so here are some ideas about how to provide that. Checking for understanding is a way to, in a classroom, to see whether the learner's getting it. So it could be that if they're just getting on and just doing it, that's a way to check. But also you've got to remember to teach and don't test. So if you're asking a question and you already know the answer, then you're testing. So just being able to catch a person in the act, seeing that they're doing something, will give you as much information about their understanding. So there's some important things to consider, that you don't provide more support than the person needs. So we've been thinking about, in this topic, about making adjustments beyond UDL. Adjustments should be planned based on the need, not on the label. So what I mean by that is that all learners aren't the same. So if you've got a student with autism, just because a guide says that some people with autism will find it helpful to wear headphones, doesn't mean to say that your particular student is going to need that support. So an adjustment needs to be done with consultation. So that's where you can ask the individual, or you can ask their parent. So if headphones to block out sound are not helpful, then that would not be an adjustment that you'd want to include. So have a think about the main points and what might be challenging for you.